Good morning, everybody. So I thought we were just going to have sort of an informal conversation. We'd be happy to obviously take questions now that you've all read the book, maybe even for the second time, and just sort of have an informal discussion about the book and the Essex and this museum and its relationship to these stories. When I was thinking about the fact that the three of us were going to be sitting up here chatting together, all three of us have encountered this story professionally in slightly different ways, although perhaps all sparked by you, Nat. Because Niles, although Niles is now the executive director of the museum here, he was once the curator and was tasked with doing an exhibition about the Essex story around the time that Nat's book came out. And then when Nat's book was made into a movie, I was tasked with doing an exhibition on this subject with many of the same artifacts and obviously the same story. So we've all benefited from looking closely at this story and trying to figure out the salient parts of it to sort of present to the public. But it's been 1 or 2 years since this book was published, Nat, and I'm wondering if, you know, and it's not the first book that you wrote by any means, but it certainly is a book that like changed the trajectory or modified the trajectory of your writing career. How do you feel looking back on it after a few years at where it has led you?
Yeah, well, it's first off, this weekend has just been so cool from my standpoint. You don't know. I mean, this is for me. This book is really about Nantucket for me. I mean, we moved here in '86. When the book came out, my daughter Jenny was graduating from high school. She was, and the book came out in May, right around that time, and Niles was the curator then, and I went on, this was all new to me. The book actually came out first in England, and so it came out, I remember I arrived in England on May Day, which is a big holiday there, and I've got a London friend, and spent the day with them, and then it came out the next day, and it was the beginning in a series of out-of-body experiences of going to the BBC and talking to, it seemed like every station in every town in England, and then spending a week there, and then coming to America, and then going off, and meanwhile you were had put together an exhibit with that. The jaw was kind of
That was it.
Yeah, and I remember I was in St. Louis at a bookstore, I think the Left Bank, and when I came into the store, there was a guy with a shopping bag, and he came up to me. He said, "I want to talk to you after your talk." And so I said, okay, and I don't what's in the bag, and so he came up, and he revealed that in the bag was a book he got while on Nantucket at a book sale of some kind, in which it was a big family Bible with the name of Pollard on it. It was the Pollard Family Bible. And he said, I shouldn't have this. This should, be on Nantucket. And I said, yeah, I think it really should be on Nantucket. And so reached out to you. He sent it to you. And I think it became a part of the exhibit, right? Yeah.
We were desperate for artifacts.
Yeah, right. So that was really, really cool to sort of, feel like it was a story that was still unfolding in a way. And then, it came out, and it was, the exhibit here was really great to see. When I finally came back, and there it was, and then sort of things went dormant for 13 years. There was interest in making it a movie from the very beginning, but Hollywood being Hollywood, there's just no obvious. What was going on. I assumed it was dead. And then came word that Chris Hemsworth had attached himself to the screenplay. And I wasn't quite sure what that meant, but I was told that was good. And then Ron Howard, who had directed Hemsworth in the previous movies, Speed, which is just a terrific movie about Grand Prix auto racing in the 70s, came aboard, and it became a movie. And I was actually a Quaker in, if you watch the movie tonight, and you will look very closely, there's a group of Quakers assembled on the waterfront, and they built a whole Nantucket waterfront. I mean, this is before CGI had completely taken things over. And it was just amazing to see this. It was a water tank about the size of 2 football fields, chest-high water, a wharf with a 85-foot replica of the Essex tied up. They had glued seaweed to the pilings of the pier. I mean, it was just amazing. And before Ron Howard would shout action, he'd say, "Cue waves." And a guy in the corner would start going like this. So there was ripples across this vast water tank. And 300 extras. They built a replica of the Pacific National Bank, with clerks inside. I mean, it's just incredible. And yes, and so Ron Howard asked if I wanted to be a Quaker. And so I even had a temporary trailer for a day. And they put a wig on me so I looked like my mother. And it was, the shooting began in the morning. It was outside London where they filmed Harry Potter. And it was November and drizzling, typical English weather. And shooting started about 7 and went all day. And, just looked like a pilgrim or a Quaker, reading Pellick Folger's poem. And that's the scene as they row out the crew to the Essex. And so very brief. And then to have, the exhibit you put together, which had the brilliant idea of basically turning it into a game. Well,
A voyage.
A voyage
Journey.
where you identified who you were in the crew. And it was, some friends had kids, middle school kids, and they're twins, and they were very competitive, and one of them ended up dying and the other didn't. And so it was a great source of internal discord. But it was just great. And so it's just, and there was a whale boat in yours that was really, really neat. And so, it was coming here that I began to learn basically the history of my home, and it led to this book. So it's been this really feels kind of like a full circle moment. So it's great to.
Well, we're always happy to have you here,
Yeah.
whether it's this story or other stories, because you have written about other aspects of island history previous to that, and all of that work definitely, obviously informed what you wrote in The Heart of the Sea. One of the things here at the NHA, the Essex is very much a local story that makes sense for us to tell in our galleries. And people who've worked with me for a while know one of my favorite anecdotes, which is that we hold all the surviving artifacts of the Essex disaster, both of them. And one of them's fake. And so when I was actually tasked with doing an exhibition to coincide with the film coming out, and I knew that Niles had done a show, and it's a story that we tell here all the time because the one truly significant artifact is on display all the time. I'm like, oh my word, what are we doing? How do you tell this story again and tell it in a new way? And did discover, of course, that there are other artifacts. There is the piece of twine, the extremely important, evocative piece of twine from Benjamin Lawrence from the boat. But we have artifacts that survive from previous voyages. Captain Daniel Russell, who had commanded the previous couple voyages, we have things from him and tokens of esteem that his crew gave to him, and wharf books signed by Obed Macy. The poems that you discovered and quoted in your book are artifacts that we hold in some cases. So there really actually was a lot to work from, but what really struck me with it was that it's a human story. Did the sinking of the Essex, change federal law, change how they went whaling, change where they went whaling. Alas, no. It doesn't seem to have had any impacts on that kind. So it is a very personal story related to these people and their families and their experiences that then other whalers who knew this story, it affected them and how they perceived their profession and what could become of them in a similar circumstance. And so what we did in our exhibition in 2015 was really to try and focus on the human side of it, which was where the journey or the game came from, of being able to pick a card with one of the 20 crewmen, and then at certain islands in the show, you put your card into a reader, and it would tell you if your person, your persona, had taken part in whatever was going on there. Did you stay at Henderson Island? Did you participate in cannibalism? Did you, go hunting? All of those sorts of things. And we created what we think is the world's first handicap-accessible whaleboat in the gallery for people to use. And then really great was, of course, we contacted the filmmakers to borrow props from the movie. And they sent us this incredible grab bag of things, including 2 costumes, a Owen Chase and a George Pollard, where I was asked by our costume mounter, do you wish us to dress the Chris Hemsworth character how these clothes should actually be worn or how he's actually wearing them? Because he had them pulled way down, low-waisted. And she's like, that's not how these were designed to be worn. Which way do you want it? I'm like, match the movie. But we got, the 2 other props that we got that really stand out to me were this whale eye, because there's a scene in the movie where they encounter their whale, and they're underwater, and the big eye of the whale, you look into the eye of the whale, and so there was this foam rubber thing with an eye in the middle, and it had ropes in the back, so you could cause the eye to move, and they lent us that. And it had been in a filming tank, and then had been stored, and we got it, and it was like sopping wet and smelled really horrible, and it was like, oh my God, it's like come right from, it was really bad. We dried it out and put it up. And then the other thing, before I'll let Niles reminisce, is they lent us a box of scrimshaw tools and fake scrimshaw. Because what's more associated with whaling than making scrimshaw? Except that in 1819, 1820, it's too early. Hardly anybody was making scrimshaw then. It's very unlikely they were doing it on the Essex. But like, what does whaling need to look like in a Hollywood production? And they had done a beautiful job looking at all of that, which I thought was great.
Yeah.
Do you have any fun stories
Well,
from your time?
Yeah, no, it was
this?
definitely, it was a challenge for sure, because most museum exhibits, you look at the artifacts that you have or the artwork, and you build the exhibit around that. And we had the twine, and not a lot else, really. Nat talked about the Bible. That was a lovely find that came through, and we had the Nickerson Journal and things that Mike has already talked about, but it was how do you begin to tell a story not using artifacts, and how do you connect to the human story, and how do you kind of get creative from a more graphic standpoint and using illustrations, and that was a real challenge trying to do that, but the timing was just incredible, and Nat was so great in terms of helping us out with that, and the timing of the book coming out, and just the general interest that was galvanized around this story was remarkable at the time. And it did lead to other finds, as Mike suggested, and the portrait of Chase that is now on loan, hopefully a gift someday, was a great find and great addition to the exhibit here. So you just never know. You put that story out there and it kind of manifests, and things start coming out of the woodwork. It was fun to see that happen. And I thought the exhibit that you did several years later was so creative in that approach, because it is a challenge. How do you do something different in a way that could really mean something to someone? And having the movie and all that, I think, obviously helped. But taking that creative approach at engaging the person so they're part of the voyage was really, really clever, I thought.
Yeah, if we didn't have a mandate to do changing exhibits every year, I would have been extremely tempted to leave that show in the gallery because it's such a core thing that we do. In fact, the small gallery that's up here that has the twine in it now, all the text in that is a condensation from the show we did in 2015 and the same graphic approach. And the portrait of Owen Chase, which belongs to the descendants, and they've been extremely gracious to lend it to us for a number of years, which is just an incredible incredible artifact. His brothers also went whaling, and we have a portrait of one of his brothers by the same artist that we were able to pull out and use as the comparison piece when doing the conservation on the Owen Chase. The Owen Chase had gotten soot on it from a household mishap, and we cleaned it off and then had to like see what we could figure out with the artist's hand. It was, oh, well, what's the brother look like? Bring the brother out. And so we were very fortunate to be able to do that. And then, this story comes up then in other ways in the other work that we do, because the people involved were part of the Nantucket whaling scene here. They came back. The people who survived had continued lives here. Benjamin Lawrence, in the last chapter here, you heard about him and that his father and one of his siblings had died at sea, leaving his mother with multiple children to raise. She was, in fact, pregnant with triplets when her husband and one child died at sea. And so Benjamin Lawrence, as soon as he was old enough to help support the family, went and worked. And she came up in research that we did about the history of Petticoat Row, because she then opened and ran a boarding house to support her family. She's one of many women who, turned to economic activities to support her family. And like, oh wait, this is Benjamin Lawrence's mother that I'm reading about. Yeah. Oh yeah. And then there's an 1807 basically travel log from a visitor who comes to Nantucket and spends some days here, and he goes out fishing at the ponds and doing all kinds of interesting things. And the captain who brings him across on the packet and then takes him away tells him, well, I'm considering moving my family to the Carolinas or Virginia, and that's Benjamin Lawrence's grandfather, who moved first, and then they were going to be moving there, and that's when the father died, and
Right.
So they keep coming up. All of the little threads here come up again. You see Pollard's name in later records, and anyway, so. It's just, we keep encountering the story.
Yeah, I mean, it was, because there was an article about the book coming out, that came out in the Globe well before the book did. And I think that's sort of led the descendants of Chase to reach out to me way back, before In the Heart of the Sea came out, because I remember showing them where Owen Chase's grave was, and yeah, I think at least she lived in, or still does, in Hanover, Mass, and all that, and so that was neat. And then even before I went on, the book was published through, I can't even remember quite how it came to me, but word that someone in Bridgewater, Massachusetts, had a letter describing Owen Chase as in the aftermath of his arriving on Nantucket, and which was whoa, and one of those, oh man, why didn't I learn about this before the book came out? But I would subsequently edit with my father, who's now at Sherburne Commons, a collection of the sources I used to write In the Heart of the Sea that Penguin published, and included in that would be that letter, which was real, how he was, it was how he was, because you think of Chase as this tough guy that nothing bothers, but this letter made it clear he was pretty shell-shocked upon his return to Nantucket. And yeah, so it's been fun. I still get Christmas cards from some Ramsdells that are in Pittsburgh, where I grew up, but never knew any Ramsdells because I didn't know this was in my destiny. But yeah, it's been really interesting how the story comes. And then one of the things when the movie, and prior to the movie coming out, they had the foreign press here in the Whaling Museum.
Oh, right, I remember that.
And so they had Chris Hemsworth, Ron Howard, here, and it was, they would, the whole museum was taken over, and it was just, what? And we had dinner afterwards at 56 Union, and when it was still a restaurant, and yeah, so it's been a fascinating journey, and I will never forget when the movie premiered at the Dreamland, and which was another kind of out-of-body experience. And it's really cool that it's going to be shown again tonight. And, do people have questions? Or?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
I just want to share one more thing
Yeah.
about the exhibit and looking at that jawbone. I remember we were, again, thinking, how the heck are we going to illustrate this story? And you talk about it in the book, that jawbone being similar in size to the, to the whale that sunk the Essex. And we said, well, we've got to use that. That could be very effective right in the intro to the exhibit. And this was the old Folger Museum on the first floor is where we had the exhibit. It was before this had been built, and that was still standing up in there on the second floor. And I remember it like it was yesterday. We waited for a nice day so it wasn't raining out, and I think there were 6 of us manhandled that thing down out of a standing position, carrying it out the front of that building, which was a pretty narrow door. We had to kind of tip it on edge because it gets pretty wide down there by the pan bone, and carried it up Broad Street, and people were honking, and 6 of us carrying, and that is heavy, I can tell you. And it just barely fit in the front door of the Folger Museum.
Well, and that was because you had it as if it was a whale
Yeah, kinda
looking
coming
at
at
you,
you, yeah.
and that just completely changed it. I mean, it was like a new artifact
Yeah,
because it
it
was, you could imagine it, like that. It was, as you came in, there was the jaw of the whale coming at you. So it was really,
And that did
really
end
cool.
up kind of inspiring that, the shape of that, when we were working to decide how we wanted to display this. We knew that that had been somewhat effective in terms of, that greeted you as you walked in the
Right.
door. And we wanted to do something similar there.
I mean, and that's the other thing that you can't. I mean, I was literally working on the book when this whale washed up in Wisconsin, and that was like, oh my, what? Sperm whales washing up on Wisconsin? What is going on? And as you'll hear in the epilogue, that talk about grounding the story on Nantucket. I mean, it just was what staff members took the all
These
the
tools.
stuff and went in and started trying out. They didn't try out the whale, but they used that stuff to get the blubber off, and then and I remember going out to the NHA's storage facility there and seeing it was Rick Morecambe, right? Who's now in New Zealand, right? But he had the bones in this bath of I don't know what was in it, but
I don't remember the
to
chemicals.
drain the oil out of it, and then to have this assembled, it was like, oh my gosh, it's all coming together. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the members of our staff, a person who was on the staff here at the time and is on our staff again, sort of led the effort to cut up the whale and save the skeleton. And they started with modern tools. And then they were like, well, they get dull super fast. Oh my God, it's so slow. And they did literally come to the museum and use artifacts, use historic cutting in tools, which also need to be sharpened all the time, it turns out, but worked much better because they were designed by decades and decades of experience for doing this exact thing.
But a curator's nightmare.
I'm glad I was not here to have to make that decision.
What?
You're
Mike
gonna do
Chaley
what?
was here then,
Mike
right?
was a curator.
Yeah, no. And it was Jeremy Slavitz.
Jeremy
was-
Slavitz was the
led
one who
led
did
the effort, and you can't make this stuff up. It was really, really cool.
Yeah, they didn't try out any of the blubber, but we did save as much of the spermaceti from the head as could be saved. They poked a hole in the head and it starts draining out, and then it solidifies pretty quickly. And according to Jeremy, they pulled over a little plastic dinghy.
Yes.
And then it filled. And then they were like, what else are we going to catch this with? And they caught as much of it as they could. And that stuff they actually did boil down to stabilize it. And we still have it in the collection.
Very
with
cool.
samples distributed out to Mystic Seaport and New Bedford Whaling Museum and a couple of other places. So it's always a good story. But we're glad to have both of these objects as centerpieces for telling these kinds of stories. But yeah, since now that you've heard so much of the book, what questions do you have about either the process of writing something like this or the afterlife of publishing something like this, or questions about running a museum? Yes.
Thank you. Can you tell us, I know the movie came out, it wasn't necessarily a huge hit. But then recently, it's on Netflix, and people are all excited about seeing the movie again, and it's had a resurgence. How did that happen? Or how did that happen?
Have you been talking to people?
Yeah, right. No, it was, who is the blog? He has a, what do you call him when you?
Podcast?
Podcast. He has the biggest podcast out there, got into some controversy around COVID. Anyways.
Joe Rogan?
Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan in December had a guest who apparently is a great storyteller or whatever, and he started telling the story of the Essex. And I remember a professor at the Naval Academy I was corresponding with said, my son said they're talking about In the Heart of the Sea on Joe Rogan. And I said, okay. And then Netflix heavily promoted In the Heart of the Sea, the movie, that I think it was January, of this winter. And it was the number one movie for at least a week. And which was, what? Where? And then someone explained to me it's because they believed it was because of Joe Rogan. I don't know. But I think it's typical of many Ron Howard movies, which come out, do okay. In the Heart of the Sea really didn't do okay, but are really good movies that are watched forever, continue. And I think I thought the reception to the movie when it came out was unfortunate in a large, the timing wasn't good. It came out the week before the Star Wars follow-up, all this kind of thing. But it's a great sea adventure. It's really well shot. The cinematography is terrific. The scenes at sea are amazing. When my son Ethan and I were in a screening room in New York, when I got a chance to see it before it came out, and we were hugging each other. We were so terrified when the ship went over in the squall, and and that was one of the other experiences. Is Ron Howard is one of the great human beings on Earth. He's really what you would think. He's smart, but he's a really good and very human guy. And when he initially called me about the book, he hadn't read the book yet. He had read the screenplay, and then he read the book, and he said, whoa, they're kind of different. And so we talked about that, and he was saying how he really wanted to visually quote Moby Dick in some way, in as many ways as he could. And if you watch the film, he does that very effectively, I think. But I mean, one of the other sort of out-of-body experiences I had was there is the Charles W. Morgan, the last remaining wooden American whale ship, is at Mystic Seaport, and it was then undergoing extensive restoration so that it could sail again, which it would ultimately do. And so so Ron Howard and the screenwriter who was doing an edit, Peter Morgan of the Queen and the Crown, and an English playwright / screenwriter, I met with them. We had lunch in the captain's cabin of the Charles W. Morgan, up there in the middle of Mystic Seaport, and Peter Morgan is kind of a arch Brit, and he says, "You're going to hate what I do to this." And I said, "No, well, go for it, man." But they really wanted. They were really looking for the motivation of the characters. They really wanted, and there was their own visions kind of thing. It's such a collaborative medium. It's so different from writing a book, and it was so that was really cool to sort of see that. And I mean, and it's an amazing cast. I mean, Tom Holland would go on to be Spider-Man. all sorts of, and so it's very interesting to see them young. Tom Holland was 17, and he and met his father. Who was, it's really, 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 yeah. So it was a fun experience that just continues.
Are there other questions? Hang on a second, we'll bring over the microphone. We're recording, so the microphone helps to get the questions on the...
So do you think in the screenplay, in the book, you don't go quite so much into the class orientation that maybe the guy who wrote The Crown did in dramatizing the, the coffins and the pollards and all. Do you think that was kind of exaggerated for the film, or do you think that was accurate to the times?
Well, films, in telling a story want conflict, and so that's, you need that for it to unfold. And I think it's probably a little exaggerated, but clearly it was there. I mean, that's where they got the seed from the book. But and how they're dressed and things like that is quite different from how it would have probably been. But it's what they were doing was taking aspects of the story and intensifying them. When on set there in England, they had created, they really riffed on the fact that Nantucket was a melting pot. So all peoples from all cultures, and so there among the extras, there was a Native Alaskan, a Plains Native American. They had just taken. And part of me was going, "Whoa, they wouldn't be there," but then no, just let it go. It's doing its thing, and because accuracy is something we're all striving for, but at some point you have to tell a story.
Right, and I would say also within the confines of Hollywood, you have to tell a story that people will buy into, are willing to believe, are willing to suspend belief and enjoy. And one of the things that stood out to me in the film actually is when you're actually on the Essex, the composition of the crew is not faithful to the actual historic composition of the crew. So they reduced the number of people of color on the crew. And I've never talked to anybody in the production to ask, why did you make these certain choices? And I've always sort of suspected that if they'd shown the actual number of people of color in the crew, it might have looked unrealistic to a modern eye, or maybe not. And it's interesting to see that the Nantucket scenes, it's all dialed up, and the Essex scenes are dialed down in order to create whatever kind of image or drama or other things that they're working with. And the only reason that stood out to me is that in our exhibition, where we were very focused on the individuals, and looking at where were each of these guys from, what were their backgrounds, what can we know about them, what happened to them in the end, and in the telling of the story from people who were involved, everybody is like, person died and we ate them, and it was very unfortunate, and it was chance, but yet all of the black crew members die. And all of the the only people who stay on Henderson Island are non-Nantucketers. And there is some other politics or something probably going on that we can only see by observing.
I went with that in the book.
Yeah.
You do a nice job telling that.
And so I think they then amped it up to a certain degree.
Right.
And there were pressures on it to be, just like you said, to be not a tent pole thing, but it had a big budget. So they were trying to, it didn't end up working, I guess, in terms of how it went. But now it's popular in a lot of ways. So, yeah. Any other questions?
Hi, when conducting this research, was most of the data already collected, say, here at this museum? Or did you, as a historian, have to track down all of it and compile it into the story? And then as a result, we were able to create the collection that we have today.
Yeah, I mean, most of the Essex-specific stuff, I mean, just about all of it was here. It took, I mean, there were things in the collection that I hadn't been aware of. I wrote about the Essex in my first book of Nantucket history, Away Offshore. And so I was, familiar with the story. I knew that Thomas Nickerson's account was here, things like that. But, it was half of a chapter. I hadn't obviously gone in as much detail as I did when wrote a book about it. And there was this was a while ago, so it's a little hard for me to drum up exactly, but there was a crew list that came from a scrapbook from Sconset, I think, or something like that. It listed Henry DeWitt and all, and that was like, I hadn't seen that. I hadn't been aware of that until I came across that, and that was one of those, whoa, wow, because it was put together around the time of it, and it was very interesting. And the Nickerson account is so cool, and the sketches on it. It's such a, talk about an artifact that has a personality of the person there. Here's this guy in his 70s who has long since retired from the sea, working, as a proprietor of an inn on North Water Street, and telling his story. And it's a composition book that you could get from any stationery store today. And there it is. It's really an amazing document. And so, I mean, that's the thing about, I wasn't trained as a historian. I was an English major in college. And it was coming to Nantucket that I became fascinated with the history of my adopted home. And so I have learned history from the ground up here. And I was, when it came to In the Heart of the Sea, back in the early 90s when I was working on that, I didn't know enough to appreciate what an amazing group of resources are here. Within 400 yards of each other are the Nantucket Historical Association, the town building, and the Nantucket Athenaeum, which has its own extraordinary collection of artifacts and manuscript material, and the newspapers. And so to have that all here is really remarkable. And yeah, it was a different NHA back then too. The collection was not as well organized as it is now, but it was a great. For me, it was a wonderful time to be here and sort of go on a personal voyage of discovery in the collection and reading all this stuff. But no. So when it came to Nantucket-specific things, most of it was here. What I really wanted to do with this book was to make it a story that was more than a Nantucket whaling story, that really got into what what happened to these people as people. And so and what was the whale thinking? These kinds of things. And so I really, the Nantucket-related stuff was here, Mystic was helpful, but it was really in exploring the literature of cannibalism, of starvation, of dehydration. And this was before the internet had kicked in. This was before so many collections have scanned their documents. And so the reference like Sharon at the Athenaeum, would order up articles and stuff like that for me. And at one point, Melissa, my wife, went into, and she would, this was in the days I'd order up something, she'd send out a request, and it would come in as a fax, an academic article. And so, she had called in to say that some of the articles had come in, and so Melissa went down to pick them up, and Sharon turns to Melissa and says, "Is Nat all right?" And she said, "Well, he's working kind of hard, and but he's okay." She said, "Look at the title of this article," and it was "The Nutritional Value of Cannibalism." And so yeah, it took me down a dark path, and while working on this, my son Ethan, who was then, I think he must have been a freshman in high school, or maybe he was in 8th grade when I was actually writing it in '98. He had a pet, a pet crab that was down in the basement. My office was in the basement, and the crab was down in the basement, and I was sort of in charge of the crab, and it was right around the time it was very interesting. When the starvation scenes are happening, that was like January and February of 1821, and that's about the time of year I was writing those scenes. And it was about that time, and they're starving to death. And I realized, oh my God, I haven't fed the crab in 9 months. And so I ordered up we were off island, and there was a wonderful store. What was it called? It was if you wanted pet supplies, you got there. So I got a bunch of minnows to feed the crab. And so, we brought it home in a big bag, and so, we were pouring it in, and suddenly all the minnows went in, and the crab's like, oh my God, and he's going like this, and he's eating these crabs, but we overfed him, and he died. Now, that's where I was like, oh my God, you killed my crab. But anyways, it was part of the old starvation experiment.
Yeah, over here in the middle.
As a member of the Coffin family, I'm still emotionally wrapped up in this. And so this story is not just a tale, an adventure tale. It has an incredible amount of darkness in it. And every time you talked about your out-of-body experience, I thought, well, there's the storyteller feeling the emotional power and being grounded back. And I was wondering if you can reconstruct how, because these are sets of families that are all influenced by the outcome. And I was wondering if you could unfold for us what the group of Quakers, who were the financiers and the organizers of these expeditions, how they rationalized this as a religious society.
Yeah. Well, there you go. I mean, that's the profound paradox of Nantucket. Is they weren't all Quakers by any means, but Quakerism kind of defined the island culturally, and pacifists to the human race, and then an entirely different attitude when it came to whales. And we have such a different attitude today because our livelihoods, our welfare is not dependent on whale. The whale, it's more an academic exercise for us. We love the whales. They're mammals like us. We identify with them. But back then, they were a whale. This is before petroleum. Whales were the petroleum of their day. This was how a Nantucketer made their living. And so they saw themselves as brave as any warriors. Obed Macy talks about this in his History of Nantucket. Conducting episodes of great bravery on the ocean, equivalent to any a warrior fighting for this country, but instead of killing people, they were providing the world with light. And left out of that, of course, is the whale. And but we, if you are economically dependent on something, the culture of that time has a different attitude than once you've moved away and you no longer have that stricture or requirement on your life. You see things differently. I mean, and that's why studying history through time is so important, because each generation is looking for different things in the past. The past doesn't change, but our perspective changes with each generation. And so our attitude, to our judgment, the judgment of posterity, is an evolving thing. It's not as if, history speaks once and that's it. As we move into the future, we will have different attitudes towards what transpired today, what transpired in the past. And it's ever evolving. Not that the past is changing, but what we yearn to know about the past changes. And that's why Moby Dick, the novel, is continually relevant, because Melville was able to capture a universal truth that each generation rediscovers on their own terms when they read that. And I think the Essex disaster, my hope with the Essex, and by the way, in working and researching the Essex disaster, I was terrified by Moby Dick, Melville. I mean, it was it's the greatest novel ever written. How was I going to write a nonfiction account of the event that inspired the climax of Moby Dick, with the huge shadow of that novel looming over me? So I made a pact with myself that I would not look at Moby Dick until after I had written a first draft. And I think that was good advice to myself. And I have to say, I did a lot, and also my Uncle Charlie's narrative poem about the Essex was something I think I had read, but I wasn't sure. But I told myself I couldn't read it until after I wrote the book, a draft of the book, and that was a real I started writing in September of 1998. I finished a first draft by May of 1999, and it was then I remember I went out on our deck and read my uncle's poem, and it talk about an emotional wallop, and then read Moby Dick, and another more diffuse emotional wallop, but that was it was and changes were made subtle or whatever, and but that's the kind of thing in subsequent books, and way offshore before that, I'm always doing it. I'll finish a book and I'll return to some of the places I've been on my research to see them again. And that was something David McCullough told me years ago. You got to have a research trip after, you don't know what you're looking for until you've actually written it. And that is so true. When I wrote The Last Stand about the Battle of Little Bighorn, I ended up visiting that battlefield 7 times, and it was a different battlefield each time, because I was, looking for something different. And but yeah. So as far as being a Quaker and rationalizing their behavior, I think they were feeling they had dedicated their lives to an altruistic cause when it came to society. They were providing the world with light, and there wasn't a lot of hand-wringing about what it was doing to the whale population.
Yeah, just a little follow-on comment with that. There's been some really good literature in the last 10, 15 years looking at just how profoundly human perceptions of whales have changed since that time.
Yeah.
The description of whales as monsters of the deep, as the great Leviathan, makes it and then a true lack of biological understanding. There was a lot of practical understanding among whalers about migratory patterns and how the animals behave, because that was part of their profession. But a true biological understanding of them as a species and as communities, like none of that had been done yet. And the creation of that literature through science, into the 20th century did not have an immediate effect on the ending of whaling globally, but it definitely has had a huge impact on human perceptions of where whales are in relation to humanity, such that most of us are like, why in the world we could never conscience hunting these creatures, these animals that are so closely related to us, but that it's very hard to cast back, both in terms of the sort of core question of I'm a Quaker, but God has given us domain over the world, and then these creatures are monsters of the deep that we're turning into a good purpose. It's very difficult to put yourself in that mindset.
Right. I mean, it was one of the whalers I quote is a young kid who wasn't I don't think he was a Nantucketer, but it's one of the few accounts of someone in whaling being appalled by the brutality of whaling. Mm-hmm. And so it did happen. But I think it's almost, you're absolutely right about how the science has changed us. The more you get to know. But I think it's almost, if you were a whaleman, you only wanted to know what would help you kill whales. To know more than that, to understand, their familial, that they communicated with each other. I don't know if they wanted even to know that in a way. And that's true of history. It's so hard to really understand how people were thinking at that time because it's such a different time. And very easy for us to condemn them. And from an entirely different set of assumptions and values.
And I think too, just carrying it to today, that idea of paradox and a people of paradox, which is actually the title of a book by a Cornell historian from the 70s, Michael Kamen, that explored this question, that Americans are this paradoxical culture. No more is it. I mean, it's never been more true than it is today, I think, in so many disturbing ways. And so it's easy for us now to look back at these whalers and say, how could they have? But look around us today.
That's what they're going to be 100 years from now. They're going to go, what were they thinking?
I'm wondering who is that Melville now who is, writing about American society today.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes.
So on that same note, they would get these whales, they would peel them like an orange, although not quite as attractively as peeling an orange, and just throw the body away. And now we get a whale, we peel it, and throw all that resource away, and keep the skeleton. What would the old timers think if they looked at what we're doing with a whale?
Yeah, I mean that's the old timers. I think if an old timer showed up, their head would explode probably, but I think they'd be really interested in this because they probably never saw the full articulated skeleton of a sperm whale, and but. Yeah, I mean, it was a tough, dangerous job where the huge personal sacrifices, where, how did these people have families? They were, so many of the male portion of the population was away for 3 years at a time, back for 3 months, and gone again. I mean, a whole society had been established here to deal with that. We talk about a division between work and family. I mean, that is just so different. So, so they saw themselves as taking immense personal sacrifices to pursue an endeavor that was, yes, you could make a lot of money, but you just as often didn't, and you could lose everything. And so, but it was. They were also very proud of what they did. And that's always been what has impressed me about the Nantucketers in the whaling era at its peak, was what pride they took in being Nantucketers, because they quite rightly believed they were better at it than anyone. And yeah, New Bedford was fine, but that was just a satellite of Nantucket, established because they realized they had problems with their harbor. And so yeah, it's so it's so easy to look back in the past and judge, but it's important to look back in the past, and to try to understand how things got to that point. And yes, there are parallels, but I'm afraid I don't know if it really helps us now. I mean, Gordon Wood, one of the great historians of the Revolutionary era, said, history can only teach you one thing: humility.
Very true. I will, following up one further comment there, I mean, this association was founded because people were proud of being Nantucketers and looking back on their whaling past, which had gone away, wanting to be able to preserve the memory and message of that, and preserving artifacts that demonstrated that. And they loved nothing so much as a souvenir. And so although nobody really had the opportunity in the 19th century to keep a complete whale skeleton here on Nantucket, they kept a lot of pieces. There are a lot of bones that were around. The jawbone in the back of the room is, famous Nantucket souvenir brought here in the 1860s by Captain Cash. And when he got tired of kids playing with it as a slide in his barn, he gave it to the Athenaeum. And when they needed the space back, they gave it to us. And P.T. Barnum came along and said, could you give this to me? And if you can't quite give it, maybe I could buy it from you. And Cash was like, no, it's just too important a souvenir for me. That was before the kids had played around on it quite as much. So I think, to your question, 19th century whalers might have processed an animal like this if it had come within their grasp, but they might have kept more of it than we might imagine, or the same amount that we've kept of it.
I also think there would be, I'm going to butcher the quote from Moby Dick, but there's a passage about, you can help me on this, but they're in a South Pacific island and they see ribs of a whale in the palm trees that have been displayed there, and somebody says how foolish it is for a man to try to understand a whale by just looking at the bones or something like that. And you really need to be surrounded by it with its flukes. And I told you I'd kill this. But
Well, no, and we'll be returning to that in the epilogue.
That's there you go.
It's kind of how, hey, that's the ending, man. No.
When we were putting this up, I kept thinking of that and saying we're never going to be able to really get at what this was like.
No, and it's a great metaphor for the act of history. You can put together all the bones of the story, and inevitably you instill it with your perspective, not necessarily what it was like then. And that is the great challenge. And what a metaphor. Mm-hmm.
Hello. Speaking of bones, and maybe I missed it, or maybe it's later in the book to come, when they were rescued and they were clinging to the bones, did they take those bones with them? Were they interred with the families, or do we know anything about that? Because it's kind of an important relic. I mean, it was those people. You can't call it a souvenir, but I mean, I was just curious if they had taken them, or maybe they did and it was a private matter, never spoken or written about. I don't know.
I didn't encounter anything mentioning that. I mean, can you imagine Pollard, that's chapters to come, returning to his aunt to say, I've consumed your son. Here are the bones. I don't know. Who knows? It might have. I mean, that is, bones are place. Yeah.
There's also, I mean, we don't know. We don't know. There is a strong, anecdotally, when people died at sea, they would be buried at sea very, very often, but not always. We certainly have stories, particularly where whaling families would, wife would go with her husband, and then their young child would die, and then they would bring the child home. And so the child would, they would preserve the child in a cask and then bring the child home. And so both sort of attitudes exist. A story I've encountered recently was a whale ship that was on the coast of Alaska in the 1890s, and one of the crewmen died, and ordinarily they would have buried him at sea. But they were within view of this beautiful mountain landscape. And the captain was like, it's simply too beautiful for us to bury him at sea. We're going to land, and we're going to bury him on land.
Yeah.
And they brought the ship close to shore. They hit an uncharted rock. The ship sank. They managed to get everybody, into the boats. So they're close to land. They managed to get the body into one of the boats. And then before figuring out how to rescue themselves, they bury the body like they had intended. And then they try and figure out how to flag down the passing steamer and get home. So what I think that is a window on is that undoubtedly they would have seen these remains as very important, and this person's experience as being very connected to their own experience, and probably would have thought a lot about what the right thing to do with the remains would have been at that time. We just don't know what they chose.
While I am here is that you're talking is maybe the boat that rescued them was that's bad juju. You don't put bananas on the boat. You don't put survivors, the bones of what happened on the boat. That was, I don't know, just a thought that came to me.
Yeah, we don't know, but yeah, they may have been buried at sea. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, we've got time for one more, and we've got one more question right here.
I'm curious about the film footage that's been shown of whaling. What is the background of that footage?
So the black and white footage that's been playing is from a 1920s movie called Down to the Sea in Ships that was set on a New Bedford whaler. And it was filmed on an actual New Bedford whaler. You can usually tell who the actors are versus who the actual crewmen are. But most of what they're doing is authentic, going through the motions of their actual jobs. The disappointment with it is that the chief actor who's playing the guy who's gone to sea.
The Chris Hemsworth.
Yeah, the Chris Hemsworth figure in this is the boat steerer, and so he's got the harpoon, and the close-ups are all of him, and you really wish that it was an actual boat steerer doing that. But the rowing of the boat and the operating the vessel and the cutting in is almost all true to form because it's an actual ship with actual real whalers.
And Ron Howard used that
Yeah.
footage, was very important to his process.
Yeah. Just putting on my curatorial hat for half a second, the challenge with that footage is, for all of its authenticity, it's 100 years after the heyday of Nantucket whaling. And Nantucket whale ships looked somewhat different. The boats looked somewhat different. What they wore was different. The process was very similar, but not identical. And it's difficult for us to divorce ourselves from this visual culture, oh, that's it. That's what it looks like. And be like, no, actually, there are earlier manifestations of this that are really hard for us to get across and convey. Not all the whale boats are painted black and white. They're often painted green and red and blue. And it's stuff like that we struggle to really push ourselves back in time with. But that's where that's from. It's actually a really great resource.
I think, and it's interspersed with, I know there are photos in the book, but there's a photo of Owen Chase there that I've seen cycle through, and Thomas Nickerson, and you'll see those repeated in the book. But and then I think some great Rockwell Kent woodcuts from Moby Dick from that illustration.
Yeah, when we did the exhibition in 2015, we borrowed from the proof set of the Rockwell Kent engravings, the proofs that he made for the publisher, which were all in the hands of a very respected and very rabid Melville collector, who I was fortunate to spend some time with.
Right? Wow.
All right. Well, thank you all.
Yeah, thank you.
We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Matt. That was fun. That was fun.